His back was arched so high, his fur stood on end. His tail puffed out to 3 times its normal size, and his claws were dug deep into the hardwood floorboards. He stared with unblinking focus across the narrow hallway, directly into the pitch-black void of Chloe's empty bedroom. Then, Dexter made a sound I had never heard him make in 4 years. It wasn't a meow or a hiss. It was a low, vibrating, deep-throated growl that sounded like a wild predator warning off a deadly threat. Story 1. The Waterfall Crawler. If you work a draining desk job in Washington, D.C., Rock Creek Park is your sanity saver. It's an 1,800-acre slice of actual wilderness, cutting right through the middle of the city's concrete grid. My name is Cody. Every Saturday, my buddy Liam and I hit the dirt trails along the creek just to escape the glow of our computer screens. Around 4 in the afternoon on a warm April day, we ditched the busy main path and hiked deeper into the ravine toward a small, secluded waterfall we liked. We sat on a flat rock, skipping stones across the water and venting about our work weeks. Everything was quiet, ordinary, and completely normal. As the afternoon air chilled, we decided to pack it in. Instead of taking the long dirt trail back toward Beach Drive, Liam pointed out an overgrown footpath on the opposite bank that looked like a direct shortcut up to the Chevy Chase residential neighborhood. We balanced on some wet stepping stones, crossed the rushing creek, and stepped onto the muddy trail. The exact second my boot hit the dirt on that side of the water, the forest went suffocatingly silent. Every natural sound, the rustling leaves, distant city traffic, chirping birds, buzzing bugs, vanished instantly. Even the rushing waterfall 10 feet behind us sounded like someone had thrown a heavy wool blanket over it. The air suddenly felt thick and pressurized, pushing against my eardrums until they popped. I stopped walking and looked back at Liam. He was frowning, scanning the trees. "Hey," I whispered, lowering my voice, without knowing why. "Does it feel weird over here to you?" Liam nodded slowly, his sarcastic grin gone. "Yeah, it feels like we aren't supposed to be here. Let's move." That knot of primal dread forming in my gut was the first red flag, warning our biological hardwiring that we had just crossed into a hunting ground. We walked fast up the narrow path, our boots making loud crunches on the dead leaves that sounded deafening in the vacuum-like silence. We hadn't gone 50 yards when the dense brush to our right exploded. Out shot a large, humanoid figure with completely wrong proportions. It was hairless, wrapped in sickly, ashen-gray skin that stretched so tightly over its skeletal frame you could count every rib. Its spindly arms reached well past its knees, forcing the creature into a twisted, crouched, quadrupedal stance, like a massive pale spider. But the detail that locked my muscles in absolute terror was the way it moved. It wasn't touching the ground. As it darted toward the creek bed, its elongated limbs moved in a rapid running motion, but its actual body hovered 4 inches above the rocks and dirt. It crossed the rushing water at blistering speed, its gray hands and feet sweeping over the creek without disturbing a single drop of moisture. No ripples, no splashes, no sound of wet impacts. It moved with the silent, anti-gravity glide of a shadow, completely defying the laws of physics. It dashed across our field of vision and vanished into the undergrowth on the opposite bank. For 3 agonizing seconds, Liam and I stood frozen. Then, raw survival instinct kicked in. "Run!" Liam gasped. "Cody, run!" We sprinted blindly up the overgrown trail toward the Chevy Chase brick rooftops. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I thought my sternum would crack. We tore through briar patches and jumped fallen logs, running with such adrenaline-fueled force that I genuinely felt like my feet weren't touching the dirt. When the canopy started breaking above us, I saw the chain-link fence marking the edge of the neighborhood 30 yards ahead. Lungs burning like copper, we slammed to a halt, gasping for air. I slowly looked back, down the dark trail. My blood turned to ice. It hadn't left us. It was crouched low on the dirt trail 80 yards back, perfectly positioned in a patch of deep shadow beneath an oak tree. Its featureless head tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle, locking its heavy, predatory focus directly onto me. The second our eyes met, the entity charged. Instead of taking the clear, straight path leading right to us, the creature darted forward in violent, high-speed zigzags. It shot 10 feet to the left, hovering over bushes, instantly snapped back to the right with impossible kinetic force, and scrambled forward again. Its gray limbs flailed in a jerky rhythm that looked like a glitching video game animation. It closed the distance at 40 miles an hour, completely silent, floating above the ground, while deliberately making its approach as visually horrific and chaotic as humanly possible. It wasn't just trying to catch us. It was actively trying to shatter our sanity and induce a fatal panic attack, playing with its food before closing the trap. I let out a raw shriek, and Liam and I threw our bodies at the perimeter fence. We scrambled over the 6-foot chain link like terrified animals, tearing our clothes and scraping our palms before crashing hard onto the paved neighborhood street on the other side. We scrambled to our feet, bleeding, and spun around, fully expecting to see that ashen gray mass vaulting over the metal right behind us. But there was nothing there. The woods on the other side of the fence were completely still, dark and silent. We ran 3 blocks down the street until we hit a busy intersection with traffic lights and people walking their dogs, where we finally called an Uber. Both Liam and I remember the encounter by the creek with crystal clear vividness, but the hour immediately following our escape over the fence is a complete foggy blank. We can't remember what we said in the car or how we got back to our apartments. Weeks later, while obsessively digging through D.C. urban legend forums, I found an archived post by a user named 350SBC. He described walking near the Chevy Chase border bridge at night and seeing a massive, unnatural, dog-like humanoid sitting under a streetlight. When his group ran toward an apartment complex, the creature launched out of the dark and slammed violently into the chain-link fence right behind them, growling with a mechanical, vibrating resonance. When I read his exact description of the location and speed, I realized the terrifying truth. That thing is an active, territorial supernatural predator that treats the Beach Drive corridor as its personal larder, using the deep ravine to hunt and the neighborhood perimeter fences to corral and terrify its prey. Liam hasn't set foot inside a public park since that day, and neither have I. Story 2. The Capitol Stone's Harvest. I grew up hunting and camping in the Shenandoah Valley, so when I moved to Washington, D.C. for a logistics job, I desperately missed the real woods. My 15-year-old nephew, Brody, lives across the state line in Maryland, and his dad constantly complained about getting him off his gaming console and out into the real world. On a crisp autumn Saturday, I volunteered to take Brody out for a full day of bushcraft and wilderness survival training. My name is Travis. We decided to go to an off-the-beaten-path section of Rock Creek Park near 5100 Glover Road, Northwest. If you aren't a local history buff, you probably don't know about the Capitol Stone's anomaly. Back in 1958, during a renovation of the actual United States Capitol building, construction crews removed hundreds of original 1828 sandstone blocks from the facade. Instead of preserving them, the government hauled them out into the middle of the woods in Rock Creek Park and dumped them in a ravine. To this day, a massive, 2-story pile of ancient, moss-covered, hand-carved capitol stones sits out there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense thickets. We parked my truck near the public stables, strapped on our heavy rucksacks, and hiked well past the established trails, deep into the untamed brush behind the stone pile, where nobody ever walks. We found a small, isolated clearing surrounded by 5-foot dirt drainage trenches and spent 2 hours teaching Brody how to build a sturdy lean-to survival shelter out of heavy oak branches, leaf litter, and paracord. It was awesome bonding time, and we felt like the only 2 humans on the planet. Around 2 in the afternoon, with the main frame of the lean-to completed, I told Brody to gather dry leaves from the clearing while I stripped branches off a fallen white pine tree near the edge of a drainage ditch 40 feet away. I climbed down into the ditch and started breaking off heavy pine boughs. Near the massive root ball of the tree, I noticed something tucked deep into the dark cavity beneath the dirt and exposed roots. It was a heavy contractor garbage bag, wedged tight and deliberately concealed behind a wall of dry pine needles, mud, and bark. My immediate reaction was annoyance-fueled anger. I figured an illegal dumper had hauled their trash into a national park and stuffed it under a tree. "Hey Brody, hold up a second," I called out, grabbing the plastic knot at the top of the bag. It was heavy, really heavy. It felt like 50 or 60 pounds, and the contents shifted inside with a strange fluid sloshing sensation as I dragged it out into the sunlight. That was the red flag, the sickening realization that whatever was sealed inside wasn't camping trash or construction debris. I untied the knot and pulled the heavy black bag open, peeling the plastic edges back. A wave of bone-chilling cold washed over me, followed immediately by a heavy, metallic smell that hit the back of my throat like rusty copper and pennies. I fell backward onto my heels in the dirt, breath hitching sharply in my chest. The contractor bag wasn't filled with trash. It was filled with dozens of 1-gallon, heavy-duty Ziploc freezer bags, and every single one of those Ziploc bags was packed to the absolute brim with fresh, dark crimson blood. There were at least 20 of them, neatly stacked on top of each other, completely sealed with 0 air bubbles inside. The liquid was thick, dark red, and completely uncoagulated, meaning it was fresh and preserved. This wasn't an animal dragging a carcass into the woods. This was a calculated, highly systematic, tool-assisted, biological harvest. Someone, or something, was utilizing modern food storage products to collect and store massive quantities of blood deep inside an inaccessible ravine, using the cool root system of a white pine as a refrigerated, subterranean larder. "Travis, what did you find down there?" Brody asked from the clearing above me, his boots crunching on the leaves as he walked toward the ditch. "Don't come down here, stay right where you are," I snapped, my voice cracking with an urgent command that froze him in his tracks. My brain spun in overdrive, trying to calculate what kind of deranged cult or psychopath was operating out here. Before I could even stand up, the auditory manipulation began. From roughly 50 feet away, deep in the impenetrable thicket of thorn bushes, directly across the trench, a sound rang out through the trees. It was the heavy, echoing sound of a sharp axe blade biting hard into a solid tree trunk. It was rhythmic, powerful, and deliberate, but there was absolutely no sound of footsteps, no crunching dead leaves, and no heavy breathing accompanying it, just the violent sound of chopping wood. Then came the water. It sounded like someone wading heavily through chest-deep water, splashing it violently with open palms, but I knew the topography of this ravine by heart. There was no creek or pond anywhere within a half-mile of our position. The sounds were completely impossible, manifesting out of thin air to disorient and terrify us. Travis. Brody whimpered from the top of the trench, his voice trembling. Can we please go? Grab your rucksack, right now. We are leaving this second, I said, scrambling out of the ditch and placing my body directly between my nephew and the thorn bushes where the sounds were originating. The moment we turned our backs to retreat, the chopping and splashing abruptly stopped. 3 agonizing seconds of silence passed. Then came the whistle. It was a sharp, piercing, 2-tone human whistle, followed immediately by 2 sharp, rhythmic clicks of the tongue against the roof of a mouth. The exact cadence a human being uses to call a dog over to them in a park. I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head and looked back toward the thicket. Standing in the shadows between 2 massive oak trees, 20 feet away from the edge of our clearing, was a man. His appearance triggered an uncanny valley revulsion that made my knees want to buckle. His skin was a blinding, chalky, unnatural white, completely devoid of any pigmentation or blood flow, like a creature that had lived its entire life in a pitch-black cave. His entire face was obscured by a smooth, featureless mask that looked like carved old bone or dirty, white plastic. He was dressed from head to toe in garments so profoundly black they didn't look like fabric. They looked like a physical void, actively absorbing the afternoon sunlight around him. He didn't make a sound. He didn't take a step forward. He just stood there, in the shadows, his masked face tilted slightly toward us, radiating an aura of pure, territorial, predatory malice. He was guarding his harvest. Walk, Brody. Fast. Right now, I whispered, grabbing my nephew by the shoulder and practically shoving him into the dense underbrush toward Glover Road. What followed was a grueling 30-minute nightmare of a retreat, fighting our way back through deadfalls, thorny greenbriers, and steep, muddy inclines. I hauled Brody up by his collar every time he stumbled, never taking my eyes off our flanks. About halfway through our trek, I caught a flicker of movement in the dense trees to our right. My heart completely stalled in my chest. The pale, masked man was tracking us, but he wasn't running through the woods like a normal human being. He was utilizing a movement pattern I can only describe as shadow stepping. He would be standing perfectly still behind the trunk of a maple tree 20 yards away. I would blink or turn my head to push a branch out of Brody's face, look back a split second later, and the entity would instantly be standing behind a different tree 10 yards closer, his body facing us without ever making the physical transition across the open ground between the trees. It was like watching a strobe light or a corrupted frame rate in a video game. He flitted from trunk to trunk with instantaneous speed, making zero noise, herding us out of his territory like sheep. He tracked us like that all the way to the boundary of the woods. The second we breached the tree line and hit the open, paved asphalt near the public stables where my truck was parked, the entity stopped at the edge of the shadow line. He stood between 2 pine trees, his chalk-white hands resting loosely at his sides, watching us motionless as I unlocked the cab, threw Brody into the passenger seat, and peeled out of the gravel parking lot so fast the rear tires smoked. We drove in absolute silence all the way back to my apartment. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the blinds tight, and sat on the couch in the dark. I hadn't said a word about what I had seen in the trees, desperately trying to convince myself that my adrenaline-fueled brain had hallucinated from sheer panic. But then Brody looked over at me, hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold his glass of water, and whispered, "Travis, why was that masked guy moving like a video game glitch? How was he teleporting between the trees?" That confirmation broke me completely. It meant I wasn't crazy. That pale, masked entity was a physical, supernatural predator operating right in the middle of Washington, D.C., using the forgotten Capitol stones as its home base and storing gallons of harvested blood under the roots of the trees. We never went back for our camping gear, and I reported the illegal dumping of biological waste to the Park Service anonymously from a burner phone the next morning. Whatever is living out near Glover Road isn't an animal, and it is actively hunting much larger game than deer.
Quick pause right here. Travis and his nephew discovered something that completely shatters the illusion that our public parks are safe. A calculated, refrigerated blood harvest hidden right under our noses. I have to ask you guys, if you were hiking off trail and found 20 Ziploc bags of fresh blood hidden under a tree root, would you immediately call the police from the woods? Or would you run for your life first and report it later? Drop a comment right now and tell me what you would do, because I read every single one. While you're down there, please take a quick second to smash that like button and subscribe to Creepy Digest. It is the absolute best way to support the channel and tell the algorithm to push these survival stories out. Now, let's head into our final nightmare and find out what happens when the monsters of the park decide to follow you inside your locked home.
Story 3. The Locked Room Phantom. When I went through a nasty divorce in early 2026, my primary focus was finding a quiet, safe apartment where my 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, and I could start over in peace. My name is Kendra. I found a historic first-floor unit in a 1920s brick building located at 3206 Q Street, NW, right on the Georgetown Bluff, overlooking the southern edge of Rock Creek Park. The apartment had hardwood floors, high ceilings, and thick plaster walls that kept out city noise. What the leasing agent conveniently left out of the tour was that the property was the site of a horrific, unsolved historical murder decades ago, and occupants repeatedly broke their leases to flee the building. To us, though, it was our new sanctuary. Because Chloe was still adjusting, we had a temporary co-sleeping arrangement in the primary bedroom at the end of the hall, leaving our door wide open so the warm hallway light could shine in. Directly across that narrow hallway was Chloe's designated bedroom, currently empty except for moving boxes and toys. Our little family unit included Dexter, a 20-pound, lazy tuxedo cat who slept at the foot of our bed every single night. Our routine was quiet, boring, and completely normal. The nightmare started on a Tuesday night in late April, around 3 in the morning. I was dragged back to consciousness by a sudden, drastic drop in the apartment's temperature. It felt like someone had opened the heavy door to a commercial walk-in freezer directly inside our bedroom. The air was biting, icy cold, and heavy with the smell of old dust and copper. I shivered and reached down with my bare foot to nudge Dexter for some warmth. My foot hit empty mattress. I sat up in bed. In the pale glow of the hallway light, Dexter wasn't on the bed. He was sitting completely rigid, like a ceramic statue, dead center in the doorway of our bedroom. His back was arched so high, his fur stood on end. His tail puffed out to 3 times its normal size, and his claws were dug deep into the hardwood floorboards. He stared with unblinking focus across the narrow hallway, directly into the pitch-black void of Chloe's empty bedroom. Then, Dexter made a sound I had never heard him make in 4 years. It wasn't a meow or a hiss. It was a low, vibrating, deep-throated growl that sounded like a wild predator warning off a deadly threat. He was terrified, trembling violently, completely refusing to cross the threshold into that hallway. That cat's biological alarm bells were ringing at maximum capacity, and that was the red flag that told me we were not alone in our locked home. I turned my head for 3 seconds, placing a gentle hand on my sleeping daughter's back to make sure she was okay, wondering if an animal had gotten into the building. When I turned my gaze back toward the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, suffocated by pure terror. The darkness in the doorway of Chloe's empty room across the hall had physically coalesced. Standing right at the threshold of the child's room, blocking the hallway, was the solid, towering silhouette of a man. He was easily 6'2", broad-shouldered, and completely black. And I don't mean he was wearing dark clothes. I mean his entire entity was composed of a dense, three-dimensional, light-absorbing shadow that had absolute physical mass. There were no discernible facial features, no eyes reflecting light, no buttons on a shirt, just a towering void shaped like a human being. As I sat paralyzed in my bed, with my arm wrapped protectively over my daughter, the shadow man began to move. He slowly, deliberately stepped out of Chloe's empty bedroom, crossed the 3-foot expanse of the hallway, and stood directly in the doorway of our primary bedroom. Dexter let out a terrified shriek, scrambled backward between my nightstand and the wall, and compressed himself into a tight ball. The entity slowly turned its featureless head, locking its focus entirely onto the bed, where Chloe and I lay. An overwhelming, suffocating aura of malevolence hit me like a physical shockwave. It projected a deep, psychic, undeniable broadcast of pure, murderous intent. Every cell in my body understood, with mathematical certainty, that this thing had not materialized to scare us or knock over books. It had come out of that empty room to cause catastrophic, violent physical harm to me and my child, and it was standing directly between us and the bedroom door. The only exit to the hallway was entirely blocked. In that exact millisecond, paralyzing terror was entirely overridden by feral, hysterical, maternal survival instinct. I didn't scream. I didn't try to reason with it. I scooped my sleeping daughter into my left arm, pressing her face tight against my chest so she couldn't see what was standing in the doorway. With my right arm, I lunged across the mattress toward the large double-hung window looking out over the side yard of the building. In a feat of hysterical strength, I smashed my palm against the corner of the wooden window screen, ripped the heavy frame completely out of its metal tracks, and punched the screen pane out into the night air. Because we were on the first floor of the bluff, the exterior window was only about 3 feet above the grassy patch of the building's side yard. "I'm sorry, baby. Hold on," I gasped, and without a second thought, I literally threw my 5-year-old daughter out the window. She landed softly on the overgrown grass below, waking up instantly and letting out a confused, terrified wail. I didn't look back toward the doorway. I scrambled over the wooden windowsill, scraping my shins and elbows on the brick, and hurled my body out the window right behind her. I hit the dirt hard, twisting my ankle, but I grabbed Chloe off the grass, dragged her toward the sidewalk of Q Street, and started screaming at the top of my lungs for the neighbors to call 911. The Metropolitan Police Department arrived within 6 minutes. 3 officers, with tactical flashlights and drawn weapons, breached the apartment window I had jumped out of, expecting to find a violent home invader. 10 minutes later, the sergeant came out to the sidewalk, where I sat wrapped in a neighbor's blanket. He looked perplexed and slightly annoyed. "Ma'am," he said, holstering his firearm, "we cleared every inch of that apartment. There is nobody in there, and more importantly, there is absolutely no sign of forced entry anywhere." "He was standing in the doorway," I insisted, shaking with residual panic. "Check the front door." "We did," the sergeant replied with a patronizing look. The front door was entirely secured from the inside. The heavy deadbolt was thrown, and the metal chain lock was slid into place. "Your windows were all locked tight, except the one you broke. Nobody came into your apartment, ma'am. You probably just had a severe night terror from the stress of the move." They wrote me off as a hysterical, sleep-deprived divorced mom who had a bad dream and threw her kid out a window. I was forced to call my sister to pick us up because there was zero chance I was stepping foot back inside that building. I almost started to believe the police until 1 week later. I went back to the apartment during broad daylight, accompanied by 2 male friends, to pack up our belongings and break the lease. While cleaning out the kitchen, I opened the door to the tiny enclosed utility closet housing the water heater tank. I reached my hand deep into the dark recess behind the metal tank to sweep out some dust, and my fingers hit something solid. I pulled the items out into the light. Hidden behind the water heater tank was a collection of terrifying physical artifacts: a pair of large, heavily worn leather work gloves, a handful of discarded, chewed-up peppermint gum wrappers, and a small, water-stained spiral notebook. Hands shaking, I flipped open the cover of the notebook. The pages were completely filled with manic, erratic charcoal drawings of sleeping women and children. And on the very last page, written in tight, obsessive handwriting, was a numbered list of 20 full names and street addresses. My name, Kendra Davis, and the address 3206 Q Street, NW, was number 14 on the list. The police were wrong. I hadn't had a nightmare, and the entity that stood in my doorway wasn't an intangible ghost that phased through a wall. That entity was a physical infiltrator that possessed the terrifying ability to physically materialize inside a locked room, bringing tangible objects from the outside world with it. It had bypassed my deadbolts, manifested inside my apartment during the day, and lay hidden in the dark closet behind the water heater, chewing gum and obsessively writing in its journal, waiting patiently in the dark until my child and I were fast asleep.
If these 3 human-centric nightmares made you want to double-check your locks and avoid the woods tonight, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Before you leave, head down to the comments and tell me, which of these 3 predators terrified you the absolute most? Are you more afraid of the hovering crawler by the waterfall? The shadow-stepping masked man guarding the Capitol stones? Or the physical infiltrator hiding behind the water heater? Sound off below. Let's get a debate going. If you have your own true paranormal or cryptid experiences, email them to the address in the description below. Remember, the dark is never truly empty. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and whatever you do, never wander off the paved path after dark. Good night.